People talk a lot about winning a lotto as an in. Interestingly, the first division prize on Saturday night was a three-way split of $333,000 each. That's considerably less than half Auckland's median price. Shamubeel Eaqub is an economist who wrote the book Generation Rent with his wife Selena. He's here in the studio with me now. Thanks for coming in, Shamubeel. It's nice to have you here. How disastrous is this?
Well, I mean, we've created this massive wedge between generations.
Bernard, welcome. I have a sense that you were taken aback by the behaviour in the meeting last night. Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, I was surprised at how the residents from the east of Auckland shouted down the young people who were simply arguing that they wanted to be part of Auckland, to be able to get onto the property ladder and to have some affordable housing. But they weren't allowed to say their piece in quiet. They were shouted down by a largely old and very angry audience in the room.
Because as I read the word intergenerational in the intro, I slightly balked from it. I thought, is it simply that polarised? But did you have a sense that that was the case? The fors and against divided on age lines?
Yeah, we really saw the difference between the old Auckland, who lived in houses on sections in those leafy suburbs on the isthmus, versus the new Auckland. Young people, often from Pacifica, Māori and Asian backgrounds, who simply want to get onto the ladder to build their own families, albeit in an apartment, not on a section. And that's what this debate is about. Should Auckland be allowed to grow and handle the million people that are going to come over the next 30 years? And how does the city organise itself to allow those apartments to be built? And a group of people last night literally shouted down the young people who are arguing for this.
And, you know, while for my parents and their parents it was absolutely possible to get into housing and have that Kiwi dream, it's simply not possible for most people living in cities like Auckland today.
Okay. And these people, the people, and this is just glib and cliched, but let's use the glib and the cliche. These people are doing what we ask of them, right? They have jobs. So when I'm 51, when I was growing up, if you had a job, there was a certain inevitability about the fact that sooner or later you would own a home. These people don't feel that's the case anymore.
Yeah, and I think the big thing was that you could see that it would eventually happen for most people. And you had some control over your destiny, and you could achieve what was culturally given a big weighting to. But it's just not possible anymore. It's not enough to be educated. It's not enough to have a job. You must have a rich parent. You must have somebody who's going to give you a hand. Otherwise, it just doesn't work.
It's not enough to have two jobs. I mean, lots of the people I spoke to, you know, both people in the capital are working. So, Shamubeel, the solution, we tend to be looking at the supply side, don't we? Certainly the government is looking at the supply side, the council is looking at the supply side. How does the supply side work, given that it takes a long time to build properties, homes?
Paul, thanks for that presentation. I had to stop scribbling furiously because it was going to throw me off course on my presentation. There are some extraordinary continuities between Australia and New Zealand that you mentioned. What I want to do is walk you through where I think immigration policy in Australia fits in terms of our open economic model. And I view the immigration program the way it's functioning now, with the emphasis on skill. Not just emphasis on skill, but the try before you buy aspect of it. Most of the recruiting we now do is onshore. So a bit over half the permanent settlers in Australia change categories. So they were temporary migrants before they settled, and that's occurred in the last couple of years. Now I view the way the program has evolved, and it's sort of evolved out of sight of the public, and I think a lot of politicians are not that clued up on what it means themselves. I've given a couple of presentations now internally to the public service in Australia on precisely this topic, that I don't think people understand how profound the changes we've had over the last 15 years in particular are. Now, one way to think about the migration program today is that it's become the fifth pillar of the open model. Now, the open model, as you've heard, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard tell you ad infinitum, and we went one more time around the world for sport in the television documentary a couple of years ago for the ABC. it was essentially a process by which 4 of the main prices in the economy were taken off the cabinet table and handed over to the market. The floating of the dollar, the setting of interest rates independently of government by the Reserve Bank, wages set at the enterprise level, and of course through the removal of the tariff wall, the absence of any government control over import prices or the quantity of imports. I would add migration as the 5th pillar for the following reasons. The government today does not have the control over the migration problem that it once did. And that is because it's demand driven and most of it is set by the market. So the numbers that come in, the government can control the flow, but the actual numbers that come into Australia in any given year is actually determined by the market and by education institutions. And the numbers themselves are quite profound. The only way to really get your head around it is to understand that we're adding an extra 1 million people a decade because of overseas migration. In each decade after the Second World War, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, population grew by about 2 million a decade. So rate of growth is actually declining because the number is pretty static. And a bit over half of that population growth for each decade after the Second World War was net natural increase. Now, for the last 3 decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, I'll give you the net overseas migration figure. I'll annualise it for you just to make it a bit easier. It was a bit over 100,000 in the 80s, and it was around 80,000 in the 90s. Of course, there's an interruption of a very, very deep recession in the early part of the 90s there. The first decade alone of the 21st century, and you should be aware of this headline number, but understand what this thing means. Population didn't grow by 2 million a decade, it grew by 3 million a decade. Now that extra million has come from overseas. Whereas in the previous decade, the 1990s, net overseas migration about 80,000 a year. We got 180,000 a year in the first decade alone of the 21st century. Now, take the annual rate now, based on the data for the last 4 years, it's a bit over 200,000 a year. That is the big profound shift. And the reason, as I said, it's, if you look at it as the 5th pillar and it's demand driven, growing uninterrupted for 25 years is one of the reasons why you'll be adding this many migrants. But the other reason we're adding this many migrants is that the Chinese and Indians are choosing us. And the Chinese and Indians are emigrating at a rate that has no comparison in human history outside of the 19th century. And think about what the Chinese and Indians are doing. These are 2 rising nations, but their middle class is emigrating for the same reasons roughly that the British were emigrating in the 19th century. The middle class is moving because they're leaving a political system that's not quite ideal for them, an environment that's degraded, cities that are overcrowded. They're actually moving for opportunity. One of the big challenges, I think, and you see it in real time because of the quality of the bulk of the intake. Not everybody shares this story, but if the predominant migrant today, if the majority of migrants today are landing roughly in the middle or the very top of the social structure, you have very, very simple question to ask about how does the rest of the population keep up. Now, sadly, the Indigenous disadvantage story, which is almost impossible for governments to get their heads around, and you've just seen the sort of chopping and changing even on the Northern Territory issue, where you see something on TV, the thing that's in the back of the public mind suddenly becomes front of mind, which is that essentially 2% of the population is not sharing the story of the last 25 years or even the story of 220 something years. And so governments go, okay, another Royal Commission, hang on a minute, we didn't think that through, 2 commissions, not 1. 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, ask yourselves a couple of questions. Your tertiary sector in education is on a big revenue-driven model via overseas students.
And remember that quite apart from the workers that Michael's people want, international education, 4.4 billion, 30,000 jobs, gone.
Yep.
So what are we going to do there?
Your schools, especially as the kids of the skilled intake come into the system, your schools are starting to crowd out local born kids, simply because there aren't enough schools. You know, and I think the story essentially for for most people who can default to the private system at great expense to the household budget, is that they assume there'll be a place for their kid there if their kid doesn't get in a selective school, or or you don't have a good public school in your area. Think about what's going to happen in the next few years where there's scarcity, where Australians previously assumed almost universal access. And this is the local-born population, not the Indigenous population, it's the local-born population I'm talking about. If you start to get to a situation in Australia where you have Indigenous plus local-born disadvantage, and it's driven primarily because we're on a default setting because the migration program is keeping the macro data ticking over, then take the anecdote of Victoria public transport system and then take it across the education system. You can't catch this thing up if you let it go. Literally can't catch it up, because then you've got the political cycle taking over, where you start to get a lot of knee-jerk responses that say, cut the program. So that'll be my first thought. But I'm interested in what the New Zealand perspective is and how anyone has been thinking about these things in New Zealand.
Well, there's New Zealanders in the room who would be as competent as I am to answer it. But the New Zealand situation is the same, but there's a few complicating factors. So we do the same polling as Andrew has been doing, and this is for the Asian New Zealand Foundation, and the responses have been trending upwards, except for the Māori respondents, and they're trending down.
It works very slowly, and that's why any policies that we have to put in place have to be done deliberately and over a long period of time, and we have to take the politics out of it, because otherwise what will happen is when there's a change in government or a change in council, we rewind and unwind a lot of the good things that might happen. The reality is that we need to do a lot of things, and when we were writing the book, it was hard to kind of prioritize all the different solutions.
Generation rent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was around how do we control demand. It's about raising interest rates, limiting access to mortgages, that kind of stuff. But in reality, that's not the big problem. The problem is we're not building enough homes close to places where people can get to work, have fun, transport. That's really what matters. And this is where local government does have a big role to play. This is not about picking on them, but they hold the ultimate tool in terms of providing the solution.
Okay, let's set aside local government at the moment, because central government, if we go to a place like Pōkeno, and for people who don't know Auckland, this is at the top of the Bombay Hills, just as you go down the other side. So people say there's no, Aucklanders think there's no life beyond the Bombay Hills. Actually, Auckland's now beyond the Bombay Hills, right?
Absolutely.
But that requires substantial infrastructure. It requires schools, it requires roads, it requires shops, it requires... That's central government, right? So we need and if central government aren't prepared to make that commitment, then the solution becomes a council response much nearer the centre of the city. Is that what you're saying?
I think it does. And I mean, the thing with places like Pōkeno, not that there is anything wrong with Pōkeno, but people are spending lots of time on roads, so there is congestion, and we kind of create the problems in other ways. But also the social problems. How do you get to spend enough time at home with your kids or your family? All of those kinds of things.
If you're sitting on the southern motorway for 2 hours a day.
Exactly. At least, right?
Yeah.
But I think the problem is because everything is in bits, right? So education is looking after schools, health is looking after GPs, transport is looking after infrastructure, and local councils looking after the local planning policies. Everybody's got different roles to play, and nobody is looking at it as a whole. And that's where leadership is required, and that's where central government is absolutely critical to get it right. But the fundamental solution has to be around much more density in close to the cities and getting much more density around transport corridors. That is the only way it'll work.
Okay. If we look at where we're sitting now, right, for people who don't know where Radio New Zealand is in Central Auckland, it's on Hobson Street. And this is a high density housing area, but those houses around us, those apartment buildings around us, are so ugly and so cheap looking and so lacking in any kind of architectural merit. Is that the template really?
Well, I don't think so. I think we can do it a lot better. And I think there'll be some people who'll tell you that planning rules and planning regulations are getting in the way of everything. But the reality is that there is cost of getting design principles wrong, density wrong, because there are costs of density. Things can be ugly. You can have too many people, not enough public spaces, all of that kind of stuff. And that's why planning regulation has to remain to make sure that we do it right. But we also know that we have to do it right in the sense that we have to produce enough housing. I was talking to a bunch of young kids in the weekend. They were having a political gathering, and they asked me, what do I see Auckland as an ideal where housing is affordable? I said one more story right across Auckland. that would do it.
Right, so people who are sitting in their villas and wherever at the moment are kind of going dry in the mouth and listening to you and thinking, no, we don't want that.
Well, and I think a lot of people are thinking density looks like high-rise apartments next to them. That's not what we're talking about at all. Auckland doesn't have that kind of projected demand in population and housing need.
So I've been doing quite a bit of work in terms of immigration. Immigration, between 2013 and 2018, this country gained 260,000 new residents via net migration. That's huge. It's never been experienced. It's 3 times higher than the UK experiences per capita. It's almost 50% higher than Australia.
You wake up to find your neighbour building a 3-storey house next to your place and there's nothing you can do about it? A new bill meant to make it easier and faster to build the homes we need is being labelled a disaster by urban planners.
I'm joined here.
In a rare moment of political unity, National and the government have joined forces on a bill they hope will see up to 100,000 new homes built over the next 8 years.
Labor and National are standing together to say an emphatic yes to housing in our backyards.
In Auckland, Hamilton, Tauranga, Christchurch and Wellington, 3-storey homes can now be built almost up to the fence line with no resource consent. Meaning we could be about to get up close and personal with our neighbours.
There is definitely scope for these provisions for some properties to result in a very dramatic loss of sunlight, as to lose almost all direct sunlight in over the entire winter period.
The big issue also is privacy. This will allow houses to be built very, very close front on to other houses on the same site, with, for example, a living room looking into a principal bedroom 4 metres away. Blinds will be drawn, there'll be miserable places to live. There's a risk that it is a disaster on the scale of the leaky home crisis, because if we get a whole lot of poorly designed houses which are very bad to live in, that's not going to work very well for people.
Renters too could be in for a shock.
So if you were renting in a property that had hardly any sun, you could actually find your accommodation cost increase, because you could be paying for more power to make your house a more pleasant place to live in, or else need to wear more jumpers in order to keep you warm.
That is a xenophobic dog whistle, Matthew, and I think you know that. Let's not blame migrants for the fact that we haven't dealt with the issues that have come from our colonisation for a long time. We have parked that. We haven't dealt with it. Immigrants prop up this economy.
No,
they do the jobs that other Kiwis are not wanting to do.
No, you get me wrong. I'm not talking about all migrants.
But you're wanting to scale it back.
No, I'm talking about scaling back work visa categories that can be
Which is migration.
Yeah, well, no, it's not all migration at all. That's incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. Migration is a plethora of both unskilled labour coming through and skilled migration labour as well. So, for example, kiwi fruit orchards and the picking season, we bring in migrant workers to fill that demand.
Yes.
We also have a range of categories over here, doctors, nurses, teachers and that sort of thing. So I asked myself the question, do we really need to be importing teachers? What more could we be doing to develop that skill?
The fact that we have a housing shortage, the fact that we have issues around Ihumātao is not due to migration. It's the fact we haven't built in the right places. We haven't. Well, you're suggesting that we should pare back immigration.
No, that's not true. That's not accurate. What I'm saying is we need to have an honest conversation about what the population dynamic of this country needs to look like in the future. Well, this is it. What are we as an economy? What skills do we need? What are we doing to build those skills in our current education system? Let's face it, our education system is not fit for purpose for today's New Zealand. We are not producing the skills adequate to keep up to demand. So, in fact, the population debate is sitting over here, but in fact, the education debate needs to be primary in our minds. What skills, capability and capacity do we need? What jobs is business and industry actually creating?
But let's not drag migration into the mix, though. I mean, if you bring that up in the... Well,
we have to have an honest conversation. We have to have an honest conversation about skills.
We should talk about our history. We should talk about our shameful history as a country and the fact that we have not done right by Māori.
Oh, well, and we're doing that. We're having that conversation. But in order to get to where we need to be, we need to have a conversation about the past, what's happening now, and what the population dynamic of our country needs to be into the future. For example, I'd love to see all 176,000 of our people living in Australia return home.
All right.
You know?
Thanks, Matthew.
But it puts an extra burden on that infrastructure system, doesn't it? Because you need healthcare.
Only if migrants as a whole are not adding to the fiscal take.
and the evidence is net they're contributors to the fiscal pool. So they're actually net payers into the tax system. And don't forget, these guys didn't draw on the health system when they were kids. Before they came here, they didn't take up your education system, but they're contributing in terms of being workers, and quite often in highly skilled jobs, paying good taxes and contributing to the economy. So, you know, you've got to have a bit of balance here, and I know Winston in particular has a big thing about family unification. You know, get fucking real.
Yeah. Can I?
Whoa.
Good on you.
I wasn't expected at 9 o'clock in the morning, but all right, here we go.
Can I add to that? Because
there we go. We'll let the Minister pick that up. We'll await our complaint from the BSA, but thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Shamubeel. Send us your thoughts. We're on Twitter at NZQ&A.